Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today I would like to address a mindset that has perplexed me for many years, namely the mindset of delighting in mystery for mystery's sake. And one can encounter this mindset in many forms. A very commonplace instance of it would be the dismay that some people show when you explain to them how a particular magic trick works. As if you reveal how the magician did it, you take the magic out of it. You take the enjoyment out of it. I've always found that very strange. A more philosophical version of that mindset can be found in the theological frameworks of many religions. I have very frequently heard religious advocates say, well, one of the reasons why this religion or that religion is so appealing to me is because of all the mystery that it delves into. And very often, these religions' frameworks are designed in such a way as to get the believers to embrace contradictory and absurd statements that logically can never make sense. A theory such as the Trinity, with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being at the same time discrete entities and also the same entity. There is no way to unravel this mystery or resolve it in logical terms. But many believers in this concept have told me that that's not the point. The point is to have the mystery and to admire the mystery and to delight in it. So this is, I believe, a very erroneous mindset, and a mindset that can have extremely adverse consequences, as I will later discuss. But first, the idea that by solving a mystery, by explaining the workings of something, be it something as mundane as a magic trick, or something as profound as, for instance, a law of physics, or the functioning of a biological organism, or the origins of a biological organism, for instance, through evolution, or, as is increasingly becoming possible, the wholesale engineering of a biological organism from non-living components. Something, for instance, that Craig Venter and his team achieved in 2010 when they synthesized the first artificial life form entirely from scratch. Starting with non-life, they created life. And in many ways, that solved a lot of mysteries. That answered a lot of questions about what it really takes for life to come about. And it also definitively shattered the theory of vitalism for anybody who still needed debunking of that theory. The view that there is some kind of insurmountable barrier between life and non-life, and that life cannot arise out of non-life, is no longer a tenable view by any stretch of the imagination. So these mysteries have been solved in spectacular ways. We now know so much more about the workings of the universe, about the workings of our own bodies, about natural laws, than we ever have in human history. And of course, there is so much further to go. We are still, I believe, in a state of barbarism with respect to what could be. and with respect to all the tremendous problems that we face, because of all of the immense mysteries still around us. So I appreciate any solution, any answer that we can get. But moreover, it's quite false to suggest that the awe and the wonder gets taken out of something if its workings are explained, and if the mysteries surrounding it are solved. Quite the contrary. Arriving at the solution and understanding the solution, understanding how a particular system really functions, that in itself, to a rational mind, is inspiring. And it does inspire awe and wonder. Now, this is not to say that the workings of everything are quite admirable. For instance, the biology of certain parasites may well be disgusting. Nonetheless, solutions, even solutions that reveal a mechanism that is aesthetically repugnant, bring about improvements in human life. If, for instance, you solve some kind of mystery about how a parasite lives and how it preys on its host, what kinds of diseases it can carry, what kinds of damage it can do, these factual bits of knowledge also facilitate courses of action that would not have been possible otherwise. The more you know about how this parasite works, the better you're able to deal with it, the better you are able to combat it, the better you are able to eradicate it, if that is the intention. So, this kind of functional knowledge, I believe, should also be inspiring because of the consequences that it brings about, the vast potential that it has to improve human life. On the other hand, I don't see any awe or wonder or beauty in ignorance. And really, mystery is a fancy word for ignorance. It is through a lack of knowing how the world really operates, what natural laws there are, that this idea of mystery arises. Essentially, there is what we know, and then there's mystery, what we don't know. And I would think any rational human being would try to expand the sphere of what we know and shrink the sphere of mystery. Not so for individuals of some persuasions, unfortunately. And there is a danger to that. The danger to that is quite literally that what we don't know can hurt us, and can hurt us badly. Consider the massive ignorance during the majority of human history that existed with regard to questions like what causes disease? What causes something like the bubonic plague? What causes something like smallpox? In the absence of genuine scientific knowledge about that, what arises is mystery, and human beings, even if they claim that they embrace mystery, naturally try to find some kind of explanation that their minds can latch onto. And so, mystery is quite frequently accompanied by superstition. Superstition like, oh, it's the Jews poisoning our wells that bring about the bubonic plague. Or it's those witches casting curses on our community. Or the gods are angry. We need to make animal sacrifices or human sacrifices to appease them. This is the consequence of ignorance. This is the consequence of, on the one hand, embracing mystery, not knowing, on the other hand, being of an inescapable mental disposition that I believe characterizes all human beings. of wanting to have some kind of explanation, some kind of answer, something that could enable one to construct a mental framework of how reality works. There is no escaping the desire to construct such a mental framework. The only choice that people have is what kind of framework they will embrace. Will it be an informed framework, or will it be a framework of superstition and ignorance? If you don't want a framework of superstition and ignorance, then mystery is something to be rolled back. Mystery is something to be diminished, eliminated, if possible, within a particular sphere of questioning or sphere of endeavor. Use reason, use logic, use observation. Make inferences about the world, make logical deductions, gather evidence, and make sure that your theories are consistent with the evidence and consistent with everything else you know. If there is a contradiction in your view of the world, then some part of it must be mistaken. It could be that much of it is mistaken, but at least something is. Delve deeply and attempt to resolve the contradiction, and you will find yourself more knowledgeable as a result. Not only that, but a rational approach to the world does reveal much of beauty, and also not just what can be found that is of beauty, but what you can create using reason and your mind applied in action toward progress and the improvement of the human condition. And if there's anything wonderful or awe-inspiring in this reality, it is that human ability to bring about change for the better. Thank you. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It has been requested that I address an age-old debate, and one that I believe to be rather simplistic, with regard to what contributes to individual human beings becoming what they are, acting in the way they do, exhibiting the characteristics that they do, and making the choices that they make. This age-old debate is the nature versus nurture argument. One side believes that really a human being's essential characteristics and actions are foreordained at birth. And while the contemporary variant of this position is one of genetic determinism, that somehow a person's future is encoded in his or her genes, this position actually existed a long time before the genetic revolution, a long time before Gregor Mendel even attempted to arrive at the idea of a genetic inheritance, and certainly a long time before Watson and Crick uncovered the structure of the DNA molecule. Indeed, the nature position of this debate was very prevalent during the Middle Ages, and later on during the Industrial Revolution, when the old aristocracy was losing a lot of its prominence in the eyes of the people. The old aristocrats were increasingly being sidelined by the new industrial class, the capitalists who were making pretty much all of the money and transforming Western Europe and the Americas through industrial activity, through the building of factories. All of a sudden, the old aristocrats, who were used to a much more agricultural society, a society where the ownership of land rather than the ownership of other productive capital was the greatest revenue generator, these aristocrats were quite afraid of what the capitalists were doing, and so they made arguments that really a person's virtue and a person's merit arise not out of anything the person does, because clearly the capitalists were more industrious than the old aristocrats. They argued that a person's essential worth arises out of his birth and ancestry, and that a person of good ancestry or good, quote, breeding was automatically a better person than a person who didn't have that kind of ancestry, no matter what that other person did. So this is the nature position. It has been manifested in one way or another for hundreds of years. And certainly during ancient times, during times of hereditary dynastic rule, this position was extremely prevalent in justifying the right of the ruler to oppress his subjects. The nurture position is also quite old. This position argues that essentially a person is what his environment makes him out to be. That is, what a person becomes is ultimately a product of who and what influenced him. If he had good parents, if he had good teachers, if he had a solid, stable upbringing, then he will probably turn out better than someone who had terrible parents and someone who was abused as a child, someone who didn't have access to education or material resources. In some respects, this position is certainly understandable. And there are some manifestations of this position, even, for instance, in the Enlightenment view of tabula rasa, a view that I sympathize with. The idea that at birth, an individual's mind is a blank slate, and what is written on that slate, so to speak, is a function of the person's environment. John Locke articulated this idea, and he had his own very interesting educational theories, not the same educational theories to which I would subscribe, but nonetheless quite fascinating ideas in his work. And this view also has certain problems and certain constraints. My support for the idea of tabula rasa is qualified and somewhat more limited than perhaps what its original adherents would have wanted to articulate. In any case, we have the nature position of determinism at birth, and we have the nurture position of a person being determined after birth by his or her environment. And that, of course, raises the question of what's missing here. Obviously, not only is this quite a bit simplistic, but it also leaves out legitimate other possibilities for what could form an individual's character and actions and accomplishments. Note that both the nature position and the nurture position espouse an external determinism, the idea that it is some force outside of the individual's control that ends up making the individual who he is. Now, I disagree with that emphatically. I do not believe that an individual is essentially just the product of forces he cannot determine or control or even, in many cases, discern. So, my essential view of what it is that leads an individual to become what he becomes is the self, or, if you would like to put it in these terms, free will or volition. That is to say, an individual within certain constraints, and these constraints are very important, and I will devote a lot of this discussion to them, but within these constraints, an individual can determine his destiny. Now, in terms of genes, and in terms of the characteristics an individual has at birth, it's clear that genes do contribute to something. That is to say, a person's genes determine aspects of his physical appearance. What will his hair color be? What will his eye color be? Genes determine in part how tall a person will be when he reaches full adulthood. So clearly there is some effect from genes. Not only that, clearly there's some effect from genes on the brain. That is, the structure and functioning of the brain is encoded within a person's genotype. The real important question, though, and this, I think, is the crux of whether or not the nature position is correct, is there that much variation within the genotypes of all human beings as to contribute to substantial differences not only in brain function, or what is called intelligence, but in personality, character, moral strength, the ability to make the right choices? And this, I believe, is an untenable position, because genes only present a part of the required components for any kind of outcome. Even with physical characteristics, one can see this. For instance, a person can be born with excellent eyesight, but if, for instance, he is severely malnourished, that eyesight will deteriorate. A person can be born with very strong hair, for instance, but in certain cases of severe malnutrition, hair loss will occur. So it's clear that genes by themselves aren't going to make or break a human being. It's clear, on the other hand, that a person can be born with genetic defects, deleterious mutations, hereditary diseases. For example, Down syndrome is clearly a crippling genetic disease. So in that case, the genes will have a dramatic effect on what that person's life is like. However, the range of possible standards of living and qualities of life and human functionality within the same set of genes can vary dramatically. So let's say you have an individual who is, for instance, autistic, genuinely autistic, not as many individuals today are, I think, frivolously diagnosed as being autistic. There are some individuals for whom autism is crippling. They cannot function at all on any level. There are other individuals whose autism does not interfere with their ability to accomplish tremendous feats, feats of the sort that most human beings would not be able to even approach. There are some autistic mathematical geniuses, for instance, and this one ability of theirs leads them to excel dramatically and leads them to successful and fulfilled lives. So clearly there's a difference. Now, in this discussion, I'll focus primarily on people who don't have genetic diseases or genetic physical defects. Obviously, those are great hindrances. But they would be hindrances in the same way as, for instance, a physical accident that brings about the loss of a limb or brain damage would be. A person who is born with a genetic disease of some sort and a person who suffered brain damage or loss of limb in an accident may be in a very similar position with regard to the physical constraints on them. So it's no major support for the nature position to say that some people have genetic defects and clearly they're not functioning as well as the people who don't. Let's look at the majority of people who do not have sizable genetic defects. Of course, everyone's body is flawed in some way or another. Everyone's body departs from what might be called the norm. I don't even consider that to be a particularly enlightening concept. But for the vast majority of human beings, the differences are pretty small. Just as the differences in height and complexion are within a certain range that doesn't really have much of a bearing on the possible outcomes for that individual. And observation suggests that this is the same for a human being's mental capacity and a human being's personality and ability to make decisions. That is, there may be slight variation due to genes. However, that variation is not enough to make or break a person's future, especially when it comes to making choices. That is such a complex phenomenon that genes alone do not even begin to approach it. Of course, the same can be said about a person's environment. One can conceive, for instance, of a totalitarian regime that brings up its subjects to think in a certain way. Consider the case of Nazi Germany, for instance, where someone who would have been a teenager when Hitler rose to power, and this person would have been inducted into the Hitler Youth and would have had certain propaganda bludgeoned into him. For instance, the Jews are evil oppressors, and they try to undermine the German people at every step of the way, and they deserve to be exterminated. Hundreds of thousands of young people were put in that position. And let's say that toward the 1940s, this person is in his early 20s, and he has a choice. He has been made to work as a concentration camp guard. What is he going to do? Is he going to assist in the murder of the Jews, or is he going to try to make their situation better? Is he going to blindly accept all the propaganda that has been fed to him, or is he going to rebel against it in whatever way he deems feasible? And of course, there are many constraints on his decision-making. For instance, he knows that if he rebels too openly, he would just not stand a chance. He would be killed. He knows that he can't end the oppression all by himself. He might be able to help the Jewish prisoners here or there. He might be able to covertly communicate with the resistance. It would still be very risky and dangerous, and he would have to do it outside of his superiors or his fellow guards noticing. So clearly the environment has some very significant constraints in place for that person. And yet, if you ask, in the event that this person chooses to kill the Jews, is he morally culpable? Clearly, the answer is yes. Clearly, the answer is that he could have made a different choice, despite all of this terrible upbringing to which he has been subject. A similar situation arises when there's a serial murderer or a rapist murderer. Very often, these individuals have been defended in court with sob stories of how terrible their childhood was. And it's true that often these people were themselves abused during childhood, and to them it seems normal to have this kind of power relationship where one party is the abuser and the other party is the abused. And for many of them, it's barely conceivable that there could be a situation where the strong do not oppress the weak. Nonetheless, this is not a plausible justification for this person to escape punishment. Because clearly, no matter what horrible things were inflicted on this person during childhood, being a victim does not automatically necessitate that one becomes a perpetrator later on. There have been so many situations in any offender's life where that offender could have made a different choice and rejected the upbringing and rejected the heinous environment to which he was subject. The more general point with regard to this is when faced with a certain environment, an individual always has a choice of how to respond. Does an individual accept that environment and its constraints and its impositions? Or does that individual rebel against that environment and attempt to break free of its constraints and impositions? Or if it's a beneficial environment, and that environment offers the individual certain opportunities, does that individual choose to take advantage of those opportunities? Or does that individual choose to ignore them or perhaps go in a different direction? These aspects of a human being's behavior and personality and accomplishments are not externally determined. The idea of free will or volition has been attacked, especially during the 20th century, from certain schools of thought. And in my view, those schools of thought really try to reduce the human being to a mechanism that is easily understood by an outside observer. That an outside observer can condition in the way that B.F. Skinner conditioned his lab animals to give very predictable responses to predictable stimuli. And in my view, that grossly underestimates the complexity and richness of the human personality and the human ability to respond to situations in creative and unexpected ways. The premises by which I come into this discussion are, one, that human beings are much more responsive and more sophisticated and cleverer than they're often given credit for being. That's not to say that human beings can't at times be appallingly and astoundingly stupid, but very often even their stupidity is a sophisticated phenomenon in the sense that they overthink or overcomplicate a particular situation in their minds, or they exhibit an intellectual association with something that really doesn't belong in the situation in question. When terrible political decisions are made that are in retrospect completely, utterly stupid, one often finds, looking into them, that some highly sophisticated decision-making process was involved, and perhaps even a philosopher or two. So this is one of the premises that it is important to keep in mind. The second premise is that for human beings, there is a lot of what one could call a positive feedback loop that arises out of fairly inconspicuous circumstances at first. In a particular situation, if you're faced with one alternative or another, and that seems relatively minor to you, but you choose one of the alternatives, that can have a variety of effects cascading into the future. Effects that you do not foresee or do not anticipate, but nevertheless, effects that you choose and a path that you choose once you embark upon it. For instance, being in a particular location at a particular time, not just part of your general upbringing or your general environment, but you happen to step into a building and you happen to meet a certain individual. And that individual could become your friend for life or could become your enemy for life. And if you hadn't been there in that building at that time, this would not have occurred. And this individual and your interactions with this person could have changed your entire way of looking at the world or the direction in which you take your life. It's a simple enough situation. It happens to many people. Another possibility is you happen to come across a particular book or a particular resource on the internet, and you have been pondering a given set of ideas, and perhaps you've come at them with a particular worldview, but your worldview has been challenged in the past. But still, there's a critical mass of evidence that needs to accumulate before you change your worldview. And that visit to the internet or that particular book that you've encountered provides that linchpin on which you're able to change your view on this position. And very often, what you've chosen in the past certainly does contribute to your choices in the future. If you've chosen to pursue a given skill, for instance, and you are subsequently thinking about how to spend your time, are you going to continue to perfect that skill, or are you going to go off and pursue some other skill? Well, it's likely that you will be more motivated to perfect the skill that you started on before, if you're good at it and you enjoy it. On the other hand, a person might decide, well, it's time for something new, and by that decision, he might embark upon a new endeavor that would alter his skill set, perhaps develop him in a new direction. Maybe he will really like that new pursuit. And with a given person, just looking from the outside, just following some kind of simplified deterministic framework, it is impossible to say what that person will do. One could make an educated guess if one knows the person well enough, but in particular, it's very difficult to predict with any degree of accuracy if one is talking about human beings in general. In some ways, this discussion might seem a little bit scattered in the sense that I'm giving a lot of particular examples or anecdotes, if you will, but in some ways that even reinforces my point. My point is there's a great deal of diversity and individuality in human beings, and a particular theory of human development, if you will, doesn't capture all of that variation. What does capture a lot more of that variation is actually knowing people, and actually looking at people not as exemplars of humanity in general, but rather as individuals, and looking at what confluence of events and decisions brought an individual to where he or she is right now. What dilemmas has that individual faced in the past? Indeed, what influences has that individual had? I'm not negating the tremendous role that parents, teachers, peers, even influences from one's reading can have on a person's development. Nonetheless, a person's response to those influences is not uniform among all of humanity. And even for a particular person, it can be very flexible. Now, that's not to say that the environment cannot do a great deal of damage. For instance, parents who abuse their children, teachers who mistreat their students, peers who bully other peers, those can greatly inhibit a person's future potential. They can put roadblocks in the way of that person's pursuit of endeavors and opportunities that could have greatly improved that individual or could have opened up doors for him. And of course, a lot of this kind of abuse can be greatly demoralizing and even crippling to some people. As I've stated in my analysis of Amy Chua's controversial Wall Street Journal article, I don't believe that hardship or suffering build character in any way. Rather, to me, it appears that it's the people who had strong character to begin with who were able to endure hardship and suffering, whereas individuals with weaker character would have been broken by them. But that's not to say that character is something one has at birth. Indeed, it may well be that the way a person obtains strength of character during times of hardship and suffering is by trying to find positive influences to counteract the negative influences with which he is faced. Oftentimes, people who are pervasively bullied or abused, for instance, might find that their studies or some kind of other independent pursuit that doesn't require a lot of interaction with people form a kind of way out of that for them. If they can excel in something, then they can ultimately transcend the abuse in a way, get above the level of their abusers. Some people will take a more direct path and will try to simply rebel against the abusers and break free of the oppression. So there's a great deal of variation. I would like to address the subject of free will in greater depth, because there's a lot of confusion about what it means. Some people will set up a straw man by which they attempt to essentially demolish the position of free will altogether. And that straw man is that free will is unconstrained will. That essentially, if a person has true free will, then he can choose anything at any time, no matter what the situation is. And I don't think anybody seriously holds that kind of view. Clearly, a human being has constraints on him. A person who walks to the edge of a cliff might think it's a really neat idea to take off in flight. But clearly his biology doesn't permit him to just flap his arms and fly. If he has some specialized equipment, he might glide off the cliff, for instance, and he might enjoy that flight. But the situation in which he's faced will clearly limit what he's able to decide. And the limits can be external. For instance, the physical reality doesn't really permit him to engage in certain behaviors. Or there could be a severe societal or legal constraint. In many countries, expressing a certain opinion will lead one to be imprisoned, tortured, or executed. And people make decisions in that context. They could still decide to express that opinion, but chances are they won't want to, unless they believe that they have a reliable way to escape that punishment, or at least they're willing to take their chances if they're challenging an oppressive regime. So clearly there are constraints. And some of the constraints might be genetic. A person with Down syndrome probably isn't going to be able to say, well, I'm going to write a philosophical treatise now. Or I wish I could write a philosophical treatise now. Probably a person with Down syndrome wouldn't even have that kind of desire or aspiration. Perhaps for some individuals, past experiences, if they were particularly harsh, would break their character and lead them to adopt a fatalistic or defeatist attitude, which might result in certain kinds of ambitions being out of the question. All of this is conceivable, but nonetheless, in a particular situation, with all of the constraints that are placed on that situation, there is still a multitude of choices. So, for instance, if you have an individual who walks to the edge of a cliff, well, there are many things that individual could do. He could just stand and enjoy the view. Or he could say, I really wish I could fly. And so the next time I come to this cliff, I'm going to bring some equipment with me that will actually enable me to fly. Or that individual could say, I wish I could fly, but it's a silly idea, and I really have no time for silly ideas, so I'm going to turn around and walk back. And you can think of probably 100 other different responses to that situation. An individual facing an oppressive regime. Well, he might not want to lose his life right now, but something might be going through his mind about the oppression that he witnesses on a daily basis. It could be, well, life isn't so bad because I still have some kind of fortune in my life. I still have food, I still have a family, I still have a place to live, etc. Many people respond that way. Another response could be, well, I can't overtly rebel against this regime, but I could bide my time and wait and see what happens. And essentially, my moment to strike will be in the future. Or he could say, there are subtler ways to rebel that aren't quite prohibited, but might be pushing the boundary a little bit. In the former Soviet Union, for instance, that might have been listening to Western music or reading Western literature. As you can see, in the same environment, for the same individual, every situation brings about a kind of fork in the road. If you choose one branch, your life will turn out differently from if you choose another. And you can anticipate some of the consequences of those choices, but not nearly all of them. Indeed, you will be surprised where your life takes you, no matter who you are. I certainly have been surprised with mine. And to the extent that you can plan for the future, you have some control. Now, that being said, I don't mean to imply that a human being's future is also chaotic and unpredictable. Again, there is a degree of control. And there is, I believe, a series of approaches that could maximize human well-being in light of all of the uncertainties and constraints and limitations that we all face. There are certain decisions that increase one's exposure to risk and certain decisions that decrease it. There are certain decisions about how to allocate one's time. For instance, if you devote yourself to your health or your intellectual development, chances are you might still get hit by a bus tomorrow. Or chances are that all of your intellectual investment will still go unrecognized, and you might appreciate it, but other people wouldn't. You might be ahead of your time, for instance. But nonetheless, it is better to do these things than not to do them. It is better to do these things, not only because they increase your likelihood of getting a positive outcome, but also because the very pursuit of these activities ennobles and elevates the individual. They are what Aristotle would call a constitutive part of human well-being. Not only are they a means to an end, but they are also part of the end in itself, which is, as I would characterize it, human flourishing, a very broad concept, admittedly. So, with this understanding in mind, that you are not just whatever you were destined to be at birth, and you are not just whatever your environment imposes on you or makes out of you, whether that be good or bad, but rather you are an individual whose destiny is at least partially in your hands, and what you do on an everyday basis is not only something that can improve your condition, but something that is part of your condition. Your activities as a human being, if they are uplifting and ennobling and productive, make you a better human being, just in the fact of your pursuing them. And you can choose to pursue them at any time, subject, of course, to the situation in which you live. In some situations, you might have more time and more opportunity to pursue a broader range of activity. But even in a highly restricted situation, you can choose to uplift your condition. And there are many stories that really powerfully relate this. The stories of concentration camp sufferers who nonetheless managed to survive that terrible ordeal. Viktor Frankl was a famous 20th century psychologist and psychiatrist who interviewed many concentration camp survivors. And one thing that he observed is that the survivors predominantly were future-oriented. They were the ones who tried to derive whatever uplifting aspects there were to derive in the drudgery and oppression that they experienced, and ones that made plans for what their lives would be like after they were liberated. The ones that perished were the ones whose thoughts primarily focused on their past and how they came to be in this terrible situation. And essentially, the thought was that all of the best aspects of their lives were behind them. But if you focus on the future, on what you could become, on ways to achieve self-improvement through the use of reason and through the recognition that you as an individual can achieve great things, then you have a much greater chance of flourishing. And you will flourish while you do it too. So the nature and nurture debate, I think, needs to be transcended. While it's clear that genes and upbringing are important factors, sometimes they are even limiting factors to an extent, they are not deterministic factors. They do not control the fate of any given human being. You control your fate through your choices.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. In his 2010 book, The Grand Design, cosmologist and theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking writes that science has displaced philosophy in the enterprise of discovering truth. While I have great respect for Hawking, both in his capacities as a physicist and in his personal qualities, his advocacy of technological progress and his determination and drive to achieve in spite of his debilitating illness, the assertion that the physical sciences can wholly replace philosophy is mistaken. Not only is philosophy able to address questions outside the scope of the physical sciences, but the coherence and validity of scientific approaches itself rests on a philosophical foundation that was not always taken for granted, and still is not in many circles. Hawking writes, quote, "Living in this vast world that is by turns kind and cruel, and gazing at the immense heavens above, people have always asked a multitude of questions. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator?" Most of us do not spend most of our time worrying about these questions, but almost all of us worry about them some of the time. Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Philosophy has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." End quote. I hesitate to speculate why Hawking considers philosophy to be, quote, dead. But perhaps the view partly arises from frustration at the non-reality-oriented teachings of many postmodernist philosophers who still prevail in many academic and journalistic circles. Surely those who deny the comprehensibility of reality and allege that it is entirely a societal construction do not aid in the quest for discovery and understanding of what really exists. Likewise, our knowledge cannot be enhanced by those who deny that there exist systematic and specific methods that are graspable by human reason and that can be harnessed for the purposes of discovery. It is saddening indeed that prominent philosophical figures have embraced anti-realist positions in metaphysics and anti-rational, anti-empirical positions in epistemology. Physicists, in their everyday practice, necessarily rely on external observational evidence and on logical deductions from the empirical data. In this way, and to the extent that they provide valid explanations of natural phenomena, they are surely more reality-oriented than most postmodernist philosophers. Yet, philosophy does not need to be this way. And indeed, philosophical schools of thought throughout history and in the present are not only compatible with the scientific approach to reality, but indispensable to it. Contrary to the pronouncements of prominent postmodernists, a venerable strain of thought dating back to Aristotle and extending all the way to today's transhumanists, objectivists, and natural law thinkers holds that an objective reality exists, that it can be understood through systematic observation and reason, and that its understanding should be pursued by all of us. This is the philosophical strain responsible for the accomplishments of classical antiquity, and the progress made during the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and the Information Revolution. While such philosophy is not the same as the physical sciences rely on it to the extent that they embrace the approach known as the scientific method, which itself rests on philosophical premises. These premises include the existence of an external reality independent of the wishes and imagination of any observer, the existence of a definite identity of any given entity at any given time, the reliance on identical conditions producing identical outcomes, the principles of causation and non-contradiction, and the ability of human beings to systematically alter outcomes in the physical world by understanding its workings and modifying physical systems accordingly. This latter principle, that in Francis Bacon's words, nature to be commanded must be obeyed, was the starting point for the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which inaugurated subsequent massive advances in technology, standards of living, and human understanding of the universe. Even those scientists who do not acknowledge or explicitly reject the importance of philosophy, nonetheless implicitly rely on these premises in the very conduct of their scientific work, to the extent that such work accurately describes reality. These premises are not the only ones possible, but they are the only ones that are fully right. Alternatives, including reliance on alleged supernatural revelation, wishful thinking, and unconditional deference to authority, have been tried time and again, only to result in stagnation and mental traps that prevented substantive improvements to the human condition. But there is more. Not only are the physical sciences without a foundation if philosophy is to be ignored, but the very reason for pursuing them remains unaddressed without the branch of philosophy that focuses on what we ought to do, ethics. Contrary to those who would posit an insurmountable is-ought gap, ethics can indeed be derived from the facts of reality, but not solely by the tools of physics, chemistry, biology, or any others of the hard physical sciences. An additional element is required: the fact that we ourselves exist as rational, conscious beings who are capable of introspection and of analysis of external data. From the physical sciences, we can derive ways to sustain and improve our material well-being, sometimes our very survival. But only ethics can tell us that we ought to pursue such survival, a conclusion we reach through introspection and logical reasoning. No experiment, no test is needed to tell us that we ought to keep living. This conclusion arises as antecedent to a consistent pursuit of any action at all. To achieve any goal, we must be alive. To pursue death, the opposite of life, contradicts the very notion of acting, which has life as a prerequisite. Once we have accepted that premise, an entire system of logical deductions follows with regard to how we ought to approach the external world, the pursuit of knowledge, interactions with others, improvement of living conditions, protection against danger. The physical sciences can provide many of the empirical data and regularities needed to assess alternative ways of living and to develop optimal solutions to human challenges. But ethics is needed to keep the goals of scientific study in mind. The goals should ultimately relate to ways to enhance human well-being. If the pursuit of human well-being, consistent with the imperative of each individual to continue living, is abandoned, then the physical sciences alone cannot provide adequate guidance. Indeed, they can be utilized to produce horrors, such as the development of nuclear weapons in the 20th century. Geopolitical considerations of coercive power and nationalism were permitted to overshadow humanistic considerations of life and peace, and hundreds of thousands of innocents perished due to a massive government-sponsored science project, while the fate of human civilization hung in the balance for over 4 decades. The questions cited by Hawking are indeed philosophical questions, at least in part. Aspects of these questions, while they are broadly reliant on the existence of an objective reality, do not require specific experiments to answer. Rather, like many of the everyday questions of our existence, they rely on the ubiquitous inputs of our day-to-day experience, generalized within our minds, and formulated as starting premises for a logical deductive process. The question, How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? Has different answers based on the realm of focus and endeavor. Are we looking to understand the function of a mechanism or the origin of a star? Different tools are required for each, but systematic experimentation and observation would be required in each case. This is an opening for the physical sciences and the scientific method. There are, however, ubiquitous observations about our everyday world that can be used as inputs into our decision-making, a process we engage in regularly as we navigate a room, eat a meal, engage in conversation or deliberation, or transport any object whatsoever. Simply as a product of routine living, these observations provide us with ample data for a series of logical deductions and inferences which do not strictly belong to any scientific branch, even though specific parts of our world could be better understood from closer scientific observation. The question, how does the universe behave, actually arises in part from a philosophical presupposition that, quote, the universe is a single entity with any sort of coordinated behavior whatsoever. An alternative view which I hold is that the word universe is simply convenient mental shorthand for describing the totality of every single entity that exists, in lieu of actually enumerating them all. Thus, while each entity has its own definite nature, the universe may not have a single nature or behavior. Perhaps a more accurate framing of that question would be, what attributes or behaviors are common to all entities that exist? To answer that question, a combination of ubiquitous observation and scientific experimentation is required. Ubiquitous observation tells us that all entities are material, but only scientific experimentation can tell us what the so-called building blocks of matter are. Philosophy alone cannot recommend any model of the atom or of subatomic particles among multiple competing, non-contradictory models. Philosophy can, however, rightly serve to check the logical coherence of any particular model and to reject erroneous interpretations of data which produce internally contradictory answers. Such rejection does not mean that the data are inaccurate, or even that a particular scientific theory cannot predict the behavior of entities, but rather that any verbal understanding of the accurate data and the predictive models should also be consistent with logic, causation, and everyday human experience. At the very least, if a coherent verbal understanding is beyond our best efforts at present, philosophy should be vigilant against the promulgation of incoherent verbal understandings. It is better to leave certain scientific models as systems of mathematical equations, uncommented on, than to posit evidently false interpretations that undermine lay people's view of the validity of our very existence and reasoning. After all, to return to the ethical purpose of science, one major goal of scientific inquiry is to understand and explain the world we live in and experience on a daily basis. If any scientific model is said to result in the conclusion that our world does not really exist, or that our entire experience is illusory, rather than just occasional quirks in our biology, such as those which produce optical illusions misleading us in an avoidable manner under specific unusual circumstances, then it is the philosophical articulation of that model that is flawed. The model itself may be retained in another form, such as mathematical notation, that can be used to predict and study phenomena which continue to defy verbal understanding, with the hope that someday a satisfactory verbal understanding will be attained. Without this philosophic vigilance, scientific breakthroughs may be abused by charlatans for the purpose of misleading people into ruining their lives. As a prominent example of this, multiple strains of mysticism have arisen out of bad philosophical interpretations of quantum mechanics. For instance, the belief articulated in such pseudo-self-help books as The Secret, that people can mold reality with their thoughts alone, and that instead of working hard and thinking rationally, they can become immensely wealthy and cure themselves of cancer just by wanting it enough. Without a rigorous philosophical defense of reason and objective reality, either by scientists themselves or by their philosopher allies, this mystical nonsense will render scientific enterprises increasingly misunderstood by and isolated from large segments of the public, who will become increasingly superstitious, anti-intellectual, and reliant on wishful thinking. The question, what is the nature of reality, is partly philosophical and partly scientific. The philosophical dimension, metaphysics, is needed to posit that an objective, understandable reality exists at all. The scientific dimension comes into play in comprehending specific real entities, from stars to biological organisms, relying on the axioms and derivations of metaphysics for the experimental study of such entities to even make sense or promise to produce reliable results. Philosophy cannot tell you what the biological structure of a given organism is like, but it can tell you that there is one, and that praying or wishing really hard to understand it will not reveal its identity to you. Philosophy can also tell you that in the absence of external conditions that would dramatically affect the biological structure, it will not magically change into a dramatically different structure. The questions, where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? Are scientific only to a point. When exploring the origin of a particular planet or star or of life on Earth, they are perfectly amenable to experimentation and to extrapolation from historical evidence. Hence, the birth of the solar system, abiogenesis, and biological evolution are all appropriate subjects of study for the hard sciences. Moreover, scientific study can address the question of whether a particular object needed to have a creator, and can, for instance, conclude that a mechanical watch needed to have a watchmaker, but no analogous maker needed to exist to bring about the structure of a complex biological organism. However, if the question arises as to whether existence itself had an origin or needed a creator, this is a matter for philosophy. Indeed, rational philosophy can point to the contradiction in the view that existence itself could ever not have existed, or that a creator outside of existence, and by definition non-existent at the time, could have brought existence into being. Interestingly enough, Hawking comes to a similar conclusion, that cosmological history can be understood by a model that does not include a sentient creator. I am glad that Hawking holds this view, but this specific conclusion does not require theoretical or experimental physics to validate. It simply requires a coherent understanding of terms such as existence, universe, and creator. Causation and non-contradiction both preclude the possibility of any ex nihilo creation. As for the question of whether there exist beings capable of vast cosmic manipulations, and even the design of life forms, that is an empirical matter. Perhaps someday such beings will be discovered. Perhaps someday humans will themselves become such beings through mastery of science and technology. The first steps have already been taken, for instance with Craig Venter's design of a synthetic living bacterium. Ethics suggests to me that this mastery of life is a worthwhile goal, and that its proponents, transhumanists, should work to persuade those philosophers and laypeople who disagree. More constructive dialogue between rational scientists and rational philosophers is in order, for the benefit of both disciplines. Philosophy can serve as a check on erroneous verbal interpretations of scientific discoveries, as well as an ethical guide for the beneficial application of those discoveries. Science can serve to provide observations and regularities, which assist in the achievement of philosophically motivated goals. Furthermore, science can serve to disconfirm erroneous philosophical positions in cases where philosophy ventures too far into specific empirical predictions, which experimentation and targeted observation might falsify. To advance such fruitful interactions, it is certainly not productive to proclaim that one discipline or another is dead. I will be the first to admit that contemporary philosophy, especially of the kind that enjoys high academic prestige, is badly in need of reform. But such reform is only possible after widespread acknowledgement that philosophy does have a legitimate and significant role, and that it can do a much better job in fulfilling it. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. There is a dangerous mentality among many people that thinking using one's mind to fathom the world and solve problems, is optional, or is only necessary for some people, such as intellectuals or individuals in high-paying professional occupations. In fact, thinking is essential and indispensable for everyone. That includes you. Our reason, our ability to accurately identify what exists and to determine how it may best be used to promote our lives and flourishing, is the only means we have of reliably surviving and improving our position. Blindly following orders, routines, or conventions may occasionally enable one to survive, if someone else did the thinking behind these external impositions correctly. But it just as often results in catastrophic failure. Every procedure, institution, and norm should be questioned using critical thinking, and every person should engage in such questioning. The result will be an improvement of societal institutions, their alignment with reason and good sense, and a vast improvement in efficiency, innovation, and happiness in all areas of human life. Always think, no one is above or beneath using his mind. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to a central question. Why do I create these videos? In other words, what am I trying to achieve by doing this? Clearly, mine is not the most popular channel on YouTube. If you count simply the number of page views or video views that my channel receives. Nonetheless, I'm not trying to win any popularity contests. What I am trying to do is to encourage a mindset of intellectualism among all of you who take the time and watch my videos. Intellectualism is not the same as simply an academic mindset. It's not the same as studying for a course. It's not the same as writing a dissertation. It's far broader than that. It is about the pursuit of truth. It is about the willingness and indeed the eagerness to use one's mind to fathom reality and to create something better than the world we have as it stands right now. To solve age-old problems that have plagued the human condition ever since humans came to be. To solve the problems not just posed by nature, by inanimate forces, natural disasters, diseases, senescence, but also by other human beings who, for failure to properly use their mind, commit a host of petty inanities and grand atrocities that, put together, results in a colossal waste of life and colossal suffering for virtually everybody. It is time to put this to an end. We have progressed as a species quite considerably in the past 200 years. Ever since the Age of Enlightenment resulted in a more systematic pursuit of reason to improve the human condition, we have had a technological flourishing manifesting itself in the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th and 19th centuries, and followed by, of course, its extrapolation through the 20th century, but also other developments, the Information Revolution that occurred with the advent of computers and the internet, the Green Agricultural Revolution that catalyzed dramatic improvements in survival in many countries that allowed billions of people to become adequately fed for the first time. We need to carry these achievements forward, but in order to do that, we need to be up to the challenge. Our minds need to be of a sufficiently high caliber and of sufficient creativity to be able to look at the world using reason and form fresh insights, not just to accept what we have been given or what has been indoctrinated into us. I want to make this plea to all of my viewers, no matter what their backgrounds, no matter what their ages, no matter what their occupations, to try to do something original in your work, whatever your work may be, to try to look at your field of endeavor and see how you personally can make a novel contribution to it. This is not a typical way in which people are taught to approach the world. Often people are taught to internalize certain patterns of behavior, starting in school, where people are taught to sit in desks, listen to the instructor, repeat back what the instructor tells them. And this approach of confusing learning with rote regurgitation and following orders imposed by an external authority tends to corrupt learning in the minds of people. Learning becomes associated with this kind of externally imposed discipline, and people tend to shy away from learning. It seems to me this is the principal cause of anti-intellectualism in many parts of the world. It is a glaring phenomenon in the United States, and one that needs to be overcome if we are to stave off the complete collapse of this country's economy and culture. So, ladies and gentlemen, the only way we can stave off that collapse is if you become a part of the solution. I'm not trying to get millions of page views with my videos, but I hope that with my videos, I can inspire at least a handful of individuals to rise to this next level of intellectualism and to go beyond my videos into a comprehensive search for truth, utilizing this vast ocean of information that we have in the form of the internet. Feel free to go out and explore and form connections and even bring them back here to this channel, into the discussions that you have in the comments that you post on my videos. Because that is what they are here for. They are not meant so much for an extensive exposure of ideas. Probably some sort of hip-hop music video would have orders of magnitude more views than my videos would. What they are meant is for an intensive development of the people who want to take up this challenge of advancing our civilization and becoming true intellectuals, becoming true Renaissance men that use their reasoning, their critical thinking, and their enthusiasm to form connections among disciplines that haven't been as well connected as they ought to be, and thereby to build novel insights that could carry our civilization forward and improve all of our lives. Thank you very much.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I have always been fond of the concept of feedback loops, and it is indeed the case that much of humankind's progress and the progress of a given individual can be thought of as a positive feedback loop. In the technology-reason interaction, human reason leads to the creation of technology, which empowers human reason and raises rational thinking to new heights, which enables still further technology, and so on. This, I think, is a good way of understanding why technological progress is not just linear, but exponential. The rate of progress builds on itself using a positive feedback loop. Negative feedback loops also exist, of course. For instance, one eats and feels sated, so one stops eating. One exercises and becomes tired, so one stops exercising. Thomas Malthus's mistake was to view human economic and technological activity as a negative feedback loop with the improved life opportunities that technology makes possible, defeated in the end by overpopulation and resource scarcity. He did not realize that the population growth made possible by technology is a growth in human reasoning ability. More bright minds out there, including the extreme geniuses, who can produce radical, paradigm-shifting breakthroughs, which in turn can result in further technological growth, far outpacing the growth in resource demands caused by increasing population. I do also think that positive feedback loops play a role in the questions surrounding free will and determinism. For instance, the growth trajectory of an individual, the process of intellectual empowerment and skill acquisition, is a positive feedback loop. By learning a skill and doing it well, a person feels better about his situation and becomes more motivated to make further progress in the skill. How does it start? This, I think, is where the substance of the free will determinism debate has historically led people to be at odds. In my view, free will plays a crucial role, especially at the beginning of a chain of undertakings, in the individual's choice to focus on a particular subset of reality, certain entities about which one would like to know more, or certain projects one would want to pursue further. Generally, the choice to focus or not is always under an individual's control, under normal conditions of the brain and body, such as adequate rest, lack of physical pain, and freedom from pressing demands on one's time. A young child who chooses to focus on productive mind-enhancing endeavors essentially sets himself up for a virtuous positive feedback loop that continues throughout life. The first instance of such focus could make a very subtle difference compared to a child who chooses not to focus, and the other child could possibly catch up by choosing to focus later. But an accumulation of subtle differences in individual decisions could result in very different trajectories due to path dependencies in history and in individual lives. The good news for all of us is that the decision to focus is always there. As one gets older, and the set of possible opportunities expands, the harder decision becomes on what to focus out of a myriad of possibly worthwhile endeavors. This understanding integrates well with the portrayal of free will as compatible with an underlying entirely physical nature of the mind. There is undeniably an aspect of the chemistry of the brain that results in human focus and enables the choice to focus. Yet this kind of physical determination is the same as self-determination, or free will, if you will. My physical mind is the same as me. So if it is chemically configured to focus, by me, then this is equivalent to me making the choice to focus, which is how the virtuous cycle of skill acquisition leading to motivation, leading to skill acquisition begins. In general, in these kinds of recursive phenomena, it may be possible to legitimately answer the question of what came first if one considers not only the types of phenomena, A leading to B leading to A, etc., but also qualitative and quantitative distinctions among each instance of the same type of phenomenon. For instance, a small amount of A leading to a little bit of B, leading to somewhat more of A with a slightly different flavor, leading to radically more of B, which opens up entirely new prospects for future feedback loops. We see this sort of development when it comes to the evolution of life forms, of technologies, and of entire human societies. If traced backward chronologically, each of these chains of development will be seen to contain many variations of similar types of phenomena, but also clear beginnings for each sequence of feedback loops. For instance, the philosophy of Aristotle, paving the way for Aquinas, paving the way for the Renaissance, paving the way for the Enlightenment, paving the way for transhumanism. History does repeat itself, though always with new and surprising variations upon past themes. In the midst of all this recursion, feedback, and path dependency, we can chart unique, never quite previously tried paths for ourselves. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am an individualist, but not a relativist. While I have no dispute with individuals determining their own meaning and discovering their own significance, indeed I embrace this self-determination needs to occur within an objective physical universe. This is not an optional condition for any of us. The very existence of the individual relies on absolute, immutable, physical and biological laws that can be utilized to give shape to the individual's desires, but that cannot be ignored or wished away. This is why we cannot simply choose to live indefinitely and have this outcome occur. We need to develop technology that would use the laws of nature to bring indefinite longevity about. In other words, I'm an ontological absolutist who sees wisdom in Francis Bacon's famous statement that nature to be commanded must be obeyed. Individual choice, discovery, and often the construction of personal identity and meaning are projects that I embrace, but they rely on fundamental objective prerequisites of space, matter, time, and causality. Individuals who wish to shape their lives for the better would be wise to take these prerequisites into account, for instance, by developing technologies that overcome the limitations of unaided biology or untransformed matter. My view is that a transhumanist ethics necessitates an objective metaphysics and a reason and evidence-driven epistemology. This does not, however, preclude an open-endedness to human knowledge and scope of generalization about existence. Even though an absolute reality exists, and truth can be objectively known, we humans are still so limited and ignorant that we scarcely know a small fraction of what there is to know. Moreover, each of us has a grasp of different aspects of truth, and therefore there is room for valid differences of perspective, as long as they do not explicitly contradict one another. In other words, it is not possible for both A and non-A to be true, but if there is a disagreement between a person who asserts A and a person who asserts B, it is possible for both A and B to be true, as long as A and B are logically reconcilable. A dogmatic paradigm would tend to erroneously classify too much of the realm of ideas as non-A if A is true, and hence would falsely reject some valid insights. These insights illustrate the compatibility of objective physical and biological laws, that is, physicalism, with individual self-determination, that is, volition or free will. There is a similar relationship between ontology and ethics. An objective ontology, based on immutable natural laws, is needed as a foundation for an individualistic ethics of open-ended self-improvement and ceaseless progress. Thank you very much. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. A widespread misunderstanding of the meaning of the term randomness often results in false generalizations made regarding reality. In particular, the view of randomness as metaphysical rather than epistemological is responsible for numerous commonplace fallacies. To see randomness as metaphysical is to see it as an inherent aspect of reality as such, as embedded inextricably in the way things are. Typically, people holding this view will take it in one of two directions. Some of them will see randomness pejoratively, thinking that there is no way reality could be like that, chaotic, undefined, unpredictable. Such individuals will typically posit that because reality cannot be random, it must, therefore, be centrally planned by some super-intelligent entity, such as a deity. Others, however, will use the metaphysical perception of randomness to deny evident and ubiquitously observable truths about our world, the facts that all entities obey certain natural laws, that these laws are accessible to human beings, and that they can inform our decision-making and actions. These individuals typically espouse metaphysical subjectivism, the idea that the nature of reality depends on the person observing it, or that all of existence is in such a chaotic flux that we cannot ever possibly make sense of it. So we might as well construct our own personal or cultural so-called reality. But it is the very metaphysical perception of randomness that is in error. Randomness is rather epistemological, a description of our state of knowledge of external reality and not of external reality itself. To say that a phenomenon is random simply means that we do not yet have adequate knowledge
to be able to explain it causally. Based on past observational experience, or some knowledge of aspects inherent to that phenomenon, we might be able to assign probabilities, estimates of the likelihood that a particular event will occur in the absence of more detailed knowledge about the specifics of the circumstances that might give rise to that event. In some areas of life, this is presently as far as humans can venture. Indeed, probabilistic thinking can be conceptually quite powerful, although imprecise, in analyzing large classes of phenomena which individually exhibit too many specific details for any single mind to grasp. Entire industries, such as insurance and investment, are founded on this premise. But we must not mistake a conceptual tool for an external fact. The probabilities are not out there. They are rather an attempt by human beings to interpret and anticipate external phenomena. The recognition of randomness as epistemological can be of great aid both to those who believe in biological evolution and to advocates of the free market. Neither the laws of evolution nor the laws of economics, of course, would fit any definition of randomness. Rather, they are impersonal, abstract principles that definitively describe the general outcomes of particular highly complex sets of interactions. They are unable to account for every fact of those interactions, however, and they are also not always able to predict precisely how or when the general outcome they anticipate will ensue. For instance, biological evolution cannot precisely predict which complex life forms will evolve and at what times, or which animals in a current ecosystem will ultimately proliferate, although traits that might enhance an animal's survival and reproduction, and traits that might hinder them, can be identified. Likewise, economics, despite the protestations of some economists to the contrary, cannot predict the movements of stock prices or prices in general, although particular directional effects on prices from known technological breakthroughs or policy decisions can be anticipated. Evolution is often accused of being incapable of producing intelligent life and speciation because of its so-called randomness. For many advocates of so-called intelligent design, it does not appear feasible that the complexity of life today could have arisen as a result of so-called chance occurrences, such as genetic mutations that nobody planned and for whose outcomes nobody vouched. However, each of these mutations and the natural selection pressures to which they were subject can only be described as random to the extent that we cannot precisely describe the circumstances under which they occurred. The more knowledge we have of the circumstances surrounding a particular mutation, the more it becomes perfectly sensible to us and explicable as a product of causal, natural laws, not sheer chance. Such natural laws work both at the microscopic molecular level, where the proximate cause of the mutation occurred, and at the macroscopic, species-wide level, where organisms with the mutation interact with other organisms and with the inanimate environment to bring about a certain episode in the history of life. So it is with economics. The interactions of the free market seem chaotic and unpredictable to many, who therefore disparage them as random and agitate for centralized power over all aspects of human life. But, in fact, the free market consists of millions of human actors in billions of situations, and each actor has definite purposes and motivations, as well as definite constraints against which he or she must make decisions. The so-called randomness of behaviors on the market is only perceived because of the observer's limited knowledge of the billions of circumstances that generate such behaviors. We can fathom our own lives and immediate environments, and it may become easier to understand the general principles behind complex economies when we recognize that each individual life has its own purposes and orders, although they may be orders which we find mistaken or purposes of which we disapprove. But the interaction of these individual microcosms is the free market. The more we understand about it, the more sensible it becomes to us,
and the more valid conclusions we can draw regarding it. The reason why evolution and economies cannot be predicted at a concrete level, although they can be understood, is the sheer complexity of the events and interactions involved, with each event or interaction possibly being of immense significance. Qualitative generalizations, analyses of attributes, and probabilistic thinking can answer some questions pertaining to these complex systems, and can enable us to navigate them with some success. But these comprise our arsenal of tools for interpreting reality. They do not even begin to approach being the reality itself. When we come to see randomness as a product of our limited knowledge rather than of reality per se, we can begin to appreciate how much there is about reality that can be understood rather than dismissed as impossible or inherently chaotic, and can broaden our knowledge and mastery of phenomena we might otherwise have seen as beyond our grasp. Thank you very much.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Here I endeavor to refute the common argument that any law, be it a physical law or a law of morality or justice, requires a lawgiver, an intelligent entity that brought the law into being, while some laws, termed man-made or positive laws, do indeed have human lawmakers. A much more fundamental class of laws, termed universal or natural laws, arise not due to promulgation by any intelligent being, but rather due to the basic properties of the entities these laws concern, and the relation of those entities to one another. To the extent that positive laws are enacted by humans, the purpose of such positive laws should be to reflect and effectuate the beneficial consequences of objectively valid natural laws. For instance, it is a natural law that each human being possesses a right to life. A positive law that prohibits and punishes murder of one human being by another would reflect the natural law and therefore be desirable. On the other hand, if any positive law were to mandate murder, as various edicts by tyrannical regimes throughout history, targeting political dissidents or disfavored minority groups have done, then that positive law would be contrary to the natural law, and therefore illegitimate and harmful. The physical laws of nature pertain to all entities, including humans, and describe the regularities with which these entities will behave within applicable situations. Examples of physical laws include Newton's three laws of motion, the law of gravitation, the law of conservation of matter and energy, and the law of conservation of momentum. If it is asserted that these laws require a lawgiver, then the lawgiver would hypothetically be able to alter these laws on a whim at any time, thereby depriving them of their universality and predictable application. Such a state of affairs would not only be highly inconvenient, to say the least, but also completely incompatible with the reality that these laws are derived from the nature of entities as they are. We can draw upon ubiquitous observation and the fact that these laws of nature can indeed be harnessed so precisely that every functional technology ever invented works because it takes advantage of them. The argument that the laws of nature could change tomorrow depends on a false perception of what those laws are, a kind of Platonic view that the laws of nature are superimposed upon the world of objects. In reality, however, objects, entities, and their qualities and relationships are all that exist at the most basic level. The laws of nature are relationships that are derived from the very properties inherent to objects themselves. They are not some higher layer of reality on top of the objects that leads the objects to behave in a certain way. That is, the laws of nature are what they are because the things whose behavior they describe are what they are. The truth that the laws of nature are a function of the objects whose behavior they describe pertains to fundamental physical laws, such as the law of gravitation. While the law of gravitation and the equation describing that law apply universally, the very existence of the law is dependent on the existence of entities that have mass, and therefore exhibit gravitational attraction. Were there no entities, or no entities with mass, incidentally both logically impossible scenarios, then the concept of gravity would not have any relevance or applicability. Likewise, the amount of mass of particular entities and their distance of separation from one another will determine the extent of the gravitational force exerted by those entities upon one another. The gravitational force arises because the entities are as massive as they are, and located where they are relative to one another. It does not arise because a supernatural lawgiver imposed it upon entities who would otherwise be completely static or random in their
behavior in relation to one another. The key parallel with the laws of morality is that as the laws of gravitation stem from the objective properties of entities themselves, i.e. that they have mass, which is a universal property of all entities, so do the laws of morality stem from the objective properties of human beings themselves, namely the biological and physical prerequisites of human survival and flourishing. Different specific decisions may be the appropriate moral decisions in different contexts, but because of the essential similarities of humans along many key dimensions, certain general moral truths will hold universally for all humans. But again, were there no humans, or similar rational, sentient, volitional beings with these essential attributes, the concept of morality would have no relevance. Neither morality nor gravitation require the existence of entities outside of those exhibiting moral behavior or gravitational attraction. A system of physical or moral laws is not dependent on an outside lawgiver, but rather on the objective natures of the entities partaking in the system. Objective moral laws include the principles of ethics, which address how a person should behave to maximize possible well-being, as well as the principles of justice, which address how people should relate to one another in respecting one another's spheres of legitimate action, rewarding meritorious conduct, and punishing destructive conduct against others. There is a natural harmony between adherence to objective moral laws and the attainment of beneficial consequences for one's own life, material prosperity, and happiness, provided that one adheres to a view of long-term, enlightened, rational self-interest, which does not allow one to sacrifice the lives, liberty, and property of others to achieve a short-term gain. Some would assert that principles of behavior that tend to maximize well-being and serve one's rational self-interest may be part of prudent or practical conduct, but are not the same as morality. In the minds of these individuals, morality, typically in their view willed by an external lawgiver, is independent of practical means or consequences, and often, as for instance in Immanuel Kant's outlook on morality, inherently divorced from actions conducive to self-interest. I, however, strongly reject any notion that there might be a dichotomy between morality and practicality, happiness or prosperity, when a long-term, enlightened, and multifaceted outlook on the latter conditions is considered. Some might be so short-sighted as to mistake some temporary advantage or fleeting pleasure for true fulfillment or happiness. But the objective cause and effect relationships within our physical reality will eventually disappoint them if they live long enough, and if not, their punishment, death, will be even greater. If some, or even many humans might be drawn toward certain pleasurable feelings for their own sake, which is an evolutionary relic of a very different, primeval environment, inhabited by our ancestors, but a tendency ill-adapted to our current environment, this is not the same as achieving truly sustainable prosperity and happiness by using reason to thrive in our current environment, or to create a better environment for human flourishing. One of the objectives of a good moral system is to guide people toward the latter outcome. My essay and video, Commonly Misunderstood Concepts, Happiness, offer more detailed thoughts on key elements of a life of flourishing and the concept of eudaimonia, the actualization of one's full potential as Aristotle and the later virtue-oriented philosophers conceived of it. Objective moral law, derived from the fundamental value of every innocent, rational, sentient being's life, posits an essential harmony of the long-term enlightened self-interests of all those who earnestly pursue truth and goodness. Unlike many proponents of an externally legislated moral framework for which the alleged lawgiver might be a supernatural being, a single human ruler, or a collective of humans, I would not consider self-sacrifice to be a component of morality. I align more with Ayn Rand's view of sacrifice as a surrender of a greater value, for instance one's life, to a lesser value, such as abstractions like nation-states, religions, or perceived slights from another nation-state or religious or cultural group. A person can behave morally, promoting his own life, respecting the rights of others, and contributing to human flourishing, without ever surrendering anything he values, except as an instrument for obtaining outcomes he might justifiably value more. Morality should therefore not be seen as the subordination of the individual to some higher ideal, be it a divine order or a man-made one. Rather, the individual is the ideal, for which moral behavior is the path to fulfillment. A person who behaves morally advances himself while fully respecting the legitimate prerogatives of others. He improves his own life without damaging anybody else's. In the process of pursuing enlightened self-interest, he also benefits the lives of others through value-adding interactions. Indeed, he may enter into an extensive network of both formal and informal reciprocal obligations with others that result in his actions being a constant, sustainable source of improvement in others' lives. The virtue of honesty is part of objective ethics and impels a moral individual to strive to honor all commitments once they have been made. The key to a morality based on objective natural law, however, is that these obligations be entered into freely, and not as a result of the self being compromised in favor of an alleged higher ideal. Consequently, a key component of natural law is the liberty of an individual to evaluate the world in accordance with his rational faculty, and to decide which undertakings are consistent with his enlightened self-interest. When positive laws are crafted so as to interfere with that liberty, positive law becomes at odds with natural law, leading to warped incentives, institutionalized sacrifices, and painful trade-offs that many individuals must make if they seek to abide by both natural and positive laws. Objective natural laws, both physical and moral, do not require a lawgiver and antecede man-made positive laws. Some natural laws, however, may require positive laws, such as prohibitions on murder, theft, and slavery, in order for the desirable outcome brought about by the natural laws to be reflected in actual, rather than simply hoped for human behavior. In order to improve human well-being, positive laws should be developed to advance and effectuate natural laws, instead of attempting to resist them or contravene them. Just as a law that redefines the value of pi as 3.2, one actually unsuccessfully attempted in Indiana in 1897, is rightly seen as absurd on its face, even if a majority votes to enact it, and would result in many failed constructions if implemented by engineers and designers of machines. So would a law that abrogates the natural liberty of individuals to peacefully pursue their own flourishing result in damage to good human beings and increases in physical harm, suffering, and injustice. A good human lawmaker should respect pre-existing objective natural laws and not attempt to contradict them. Thank you very much.